In the early 1970s, the automobile was not just a means of transportation. It was an emblem of ambition, a shining sculpture of steel and chrome that mirrored humanity's belief in progress without limits. The Western world, especially the United States, moved to the rhythm of V8 engines and gasoline that seemed as abundant as air. Gas stations were everywhere, fuel was cheap, and car manufacturers competed not on efficiency, but on excess, more power, more size, more presence. Detroit, the beating heart of the American automobile industry, was at the height of its glory. The streets were dominated by behemoths, Cadillacs that stretched nearly 6 meters, Buicks that floated like ships, and Fords that roared with confidence. These were not just vehicles. They were declarations of success, reflections of post-war optimism, and extensions of the suburban dream. The post-war boom had created a generation that equated freedom with horsepower and luxury with size. Across the Atlantic, Europe was recovering from its own wartime scars. Yet the European car, though smaller, shared the same sense of optimism. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy had each built automotive empires in their own way. The Mini, the Fiat 500, and the Citroën 2CV were not statements of power, but of ingenuity, clever responses to the continent's narrower streets and tighter economies. Still, even in Europe, the late 1960s and early 1970s saw a drift toward comfort and prestige. The Mercedes S-Class, the BMW 7 Series, the Jaguar XJ. The world was growing, and so were its cars. Japan, meanwhile, was quietly rewriting the rules. Brands like Toyota, Honda, and Datsun, soon to be Nissan, were exporting small, affordable, and surprisingly reliable cars. To many Western eyes, they were curiosities, toy cars with small engines and light bodies. But Japan had already understood something fundamental. Efficiency was not a compromise, it was a virtue. That illusion of endless motion would soon collide with reality. Beneath the surface of the roaring engines, the world economy was tied to a fragile thread: oil. And that thread was about to snap. It began in the autumn of 1973, when a geopolitical decision rippled across every highway on Earth. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OAPEC, announced an oil embargo targeting nations that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Overnight, the global oil supply shrank, and the price of crude quadrupled. Gasoline, once taken for granted, suddenly became a luxury. The effects were immediate and shocking. Long queues formed at gas stations in the United States and Europe. Drivers waited for hours, only to find no gas signs hung across the pumps. Governments imposed rationing. Sundays became car-free in parts of Europe. The endless summer of the automobile had frozen overnight. For the first time, the car, the symbol of freedom, became a burden. People questioned whether they truly needed large engines, heavy bodies, and 2 tons of chrome to move from one place to another. The public mood shifted, and with it, the industry trembled. The American auto industry, built on the gospel of size and power, was caught completely off guard. The Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, had spent decades perfecting the art of the giant car. They suddenly found themselves trying to sell products no one wanted. Fuel efficiency had never been a design priority. Now, it was the only thing that mattered. In Japan, however, things were different. Their cars, small, lightweight, frugal, suddenly became global darlings. The Toyota Corolla, the Honda Civic, and the Datsun 120Y surged in popularity. Where American cars gulped, Japanese cars sipped. And consumers noticed. Europe, standing between the two worlds, responded with pragmatism. Companies like Volkswagen, Renault, Peugeot, and Fiat had already been making smaller cars, but now they refined them further. The idea of compact luxury took root. Vehicles that could still be stylish, safe, and comfortable, but without waste. The oil crisis was more than a shortage. It was a psychological shock. For decades, society had equated progress with consumption. Now the message was inverted. To survive was to economize. Automakers realized that success would no longer be measured in horsepower, but in miles per gallon. In Detroit, panic turned into reluctant adaptation. General Motors introduced the Chevrolet Vega and later the Chevette. Ford produced the Pinto. Chrysler experimented with smaller Dodges and Plymouths. Yet these early attempts were often half-hearted, cost-cutting compromises that failed to capture hearts. Consumers compared them to Japanese imports and found them lacking in reliability, refinement, and imagination. Japan's approach, on the other hand, was methodical. The oil crisis accelerated what had already been years of disciplined engineering. Honda's CVCC engine, compound vortex-controlled combustion, achieved cleaner emissions and better fuel economy without sacrificing performance. Toyota refined its production systems, leading to what would later be known as the Toyota Production System, the ancestor of modern lean manufacturing. Efficiency became both philosophy and identity. Europe's response was more cultural. The crisis inspired a rethinking of mobility itself. Car design became more aerodynamic, engines smaller and smarter. Companies like Volkswagen built the first Golf, a compact hatchback that redefined practicality. Peugeot and Renault doubled down on simplicity and strength. The Citroën GS, and later the Visa, embodied the French pursuit of comfort without waste. Governments, too, began to legislate efficiency. In the United States, the CAFE, Corporate Average Fuel Economy, standards were introduced in 1975, setting minimum average fuel economy targets for automakers. This forced even reluctant manufacturers to downsize. In Europe, emissions and fuel taxes guided the same outcome through market pressure. Yet what truly changed was not metal or mechanics. It was mentality. The oil crisis humbled the automobile. Cars could no longer be shrines to indulgence. They had to be rational companions. Advertisements shifted tone. Instead of boasting about power, they spoke of thrift, technology, and responsibility. The once glamorous image of cruising in a massive convertible down Route 66 gave way to a new aesthetic: nimble, efficient, and smart. A new generation of drivers grew up valuing maneuverability over muscle. They embraced hatchbacks, front-wheel drive, and engines that did more with less. By the late 1970s, a subtle yet profound transformation was underway. The world was not only buying smaller cars, it was reimagining what a car should be. In this crucible of scarcity, innovation flourished. When the second oil shock hit in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, the message became permanent. The automotive world would never again assume that fuel was infinite. Manufacturers who had hesitated in 1973 now acted decisively. Aerodynamics became a science. Plastic replaced chrome. Weight reduction became an obsession. By the early 1980s, the compact car was not just a product category, it was the future. Volkswagen had the Golf, Ford had the Fiesta, Renault had the 5, Fiat had the Uno, and Japan had a fleet of Corolla, Civic, and Sunny models dominating global markets. The formula was clear: small, light, economical, and practical. But beyond function, design philosophy shifted too. Compact cars became expressions of efficiency as style. Where once size equaled status, now intelligence and restraint did. Engineers began to view every component as an opportunity for optimization, a discipline that would define automotive design for decades to come. Europe led the artistic front. The 1980s were a golden age for minimalist, purposeful car design. Peugeot introduced the 205 in 1983, a perfect embodiment of form following function. Compact, elegant, and full of character, it became not just a car, but a cultural icon. In Italy, Giorgetto Giuliaro and Pininfarina sculpted hatchbacks with geometric precision. The small car had become beautiful. Meanwhile, Japan led the technological front. The 1980s saw the rise of fuel injection, turbocharging, and variable valve timing, innovations driven by the quest to extract more power from smaller engines. The phrase Japanese reliability became synonymous with excellence. Every automaker, from Detroit to Paris, began to copy Japan's quality standards. By the mid-1980s, driving a small car was no longer seen as an act of compromise. It was a statement, one of intelligence, practicality, and even environmental awareness. The compact car became the global equalizer, attainable yet aspirational, functional yet full of identity. For families, it represented security during uncertain economic times. For youth, it was independence without extravagance. For cities, it was a solution to congestion and pollution. And for automakers, it was a new battlefield, one where creativity, not cubic inches, determined victory. This was the foundation upon which the 1990s would build. A decade where the lessons of scarcity would merge with the optimism of a new generation. A decade that would give birth to icons like the Peugeot 106, Renault Clio, and Fiat Punto, small cars that carried the wisdom of crisis in their DNA, yet radiated the joy of modern life. The world had learned that size was not the measure of greatness. Efficiency, balance, and imagination were. The era of shrinking steel was not one of loss, but of rebirth. The 1980s began with an unease that carried the echo of the previous decade's fuel panic. The memories of empty gas stations and rationing stickers still haunted the public mind. The automobile, once a symbol of unshakable confidence, was now an emblem of fragility. Yet, out of that fragility, a new age of ingenuity was beginning, one that would transform cars from heavy monuments of luxury into nimble machines of purpose. The oil crises of the 1970s had humbled every manufacturer. Some collapsed, others evolved. By the dawn of the 1980s, the survivors had learned that success would depend on precision, discipline, and imagination rather than excess. Engineers became philosophers, designers became futurists, and marketing departments learned a new vocabulary: efficiency, aerodynamics, and responsibility. This was not merely an industrial change, it was cultural. The car was being reborn as a tool of rational optimism. Efficiency as art in Europe, where roads were narrow and fuel expensive. The compact car was no longer a novelty. It was the default. But something remarkable began to happen in this decade. Efficiency became beautiful. The Italians had long understood the poetry of design. Fiat's engineers, in collaboration with the master designer Giorgetto Giuliaro, produced cars that combined utility with geometric elegance. The Fiat Panda of 1980, boxy and unapologetically simple, was a triumph of honesty. It was not trying to impress, it was trying to serve. And yet, in that utilitarian form lay a strange allure, a reflection of an age that celebrated cleverness over extravagance. Germany, ever the engineer's nation, found its rhythm in discipline. Volkswagen's Golf, born in 1974 but perfected in the 1980s, became the global benchmark for compact cars. Its boxy frame concealed a revolution: front-wheel drive, efficient engines, and a cabin that maximized every inch of space. The Golf was not just a car, it was a philosophy. It proved that small did not mean lesser. It meant smarter. France, meanwhile, turned the idea of comfort into an art form. Citroën, Renault, and Peugeot each brought their own interpretation of the compact ideal. The Citroën BX, with its futuristic lines and high-drop pneumatic suspension, looked like something that had driven out of a sci-fi film. Renault's 5 and later the Super 5 were both playful and practical, embodying the French spirit of charm without arrogance. And Peugeot, quiet, disciplined, and increasingly confident, began preparing what would become its masterpiece of the decade: the 205. The Peugeot 205 and the birth of a modern icon. When Peugeot unveiled the 205 in 1983, the world saw more than just another small car. It saw the perfection of everything the downsizing era had been trying to achieve. Compact but elegant, light yet solid, economical yet full of life. The 205 was a synthesis of restraint and joy. Its design by Gerard Welter and Paul Bracq was simple, almost modest, but every line served a purpose. It was agile, affordable, and engineered with the precision that France had sometimes lacked in earlier decades. The 205 GTI, launched shortly after, turned that rationality into adrenaline. Suddenly, efficiency and excitement were not opposites, they were partners. The GTI became a symbol of youthful energy, proof that small cars could thrill. Peugeot's success was not isolated. Across Europe, similar revolutions were unfolding. The Volkswagen Polo, Ford Fiesta, Renault 5, Fiat Uno, and Opel Corsa formed a constellation of vehicles that defined an entire generation. The compact car was no longer the poor man's choice. It was the new normal. The impact rippled through culture. In music videos, television ads, and cityscapes, small cars became the visual language of modern life. They were colorful, approachable, and human in scale. They belonged to the rhythm of the streets, not to the isolation of highways. In a world recovering from crisis, they represented balance. Japan's quiet domination. While Europe perfected the art of compact elegance, Japan continued to advance with quiet precision. The Japanese had mastered the philosophy of Kaizen, continuous improvement, and applied it to every bolt and seam. Cars like the Honda Civic, Toyota Corolla, and Nissan Sunny evolved with an almost biological grace. Each generation became lighter, stronger, and more efficient. Their reliability became legendary, a selling point so powerful that it began to erode decades of Western automotive dominance. Japanese manufacturers were also pioneers in the science of small engines. Turbocharging, electronic fuel injection, and variable valve timing were developed not as luxuries, but as tools to extract more performance from less fuel. A 1.3-liter engine could now deliver the performance of a 1.8 without the penalty of consumption. The once mocked small car had become a marvel of technology. Even luxury began to shrink in Japan. Toyota's Crown and Nissan's Cedric, though modest by American standards, offered quiet refinement in compact frames. The idea that comfort could coexist with restraint reshaped global expectations. By the mid-1980s, the balance of power had shifted. Japanese cars were not just invading Western markets, they were redefining them. The world was learning to admire precision over extravagance. The global compact culture. The compact car was more than a product. It was becoming a cultural identity. It reflected a generation that valued intelligence over indulgence. Cities were growing, fuel prices remained unpredictable, and environmental awareness was beginning to surface as a global concern. In architecture, minimalism became fashionable. In fashion, function became chic. The car, too, adapted to this new sensibility. No longer an expression of dominance, it became a companion, efficient, modest, and responsive. Advertising mirrored the shift. Gone were the grand desert highways and roaring engines of 1960s commercials. Now, the camera zoomed through narrow European streets, following a small hatchback weaving gracefully through the crowd. The tagline was no longer "power beyond measure," but "smart thinking." This aesthetic reshaping wasn't limited to the West. Developing nations embraced small cars as symbols of progress. In Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the compact car represented access, the ability to own mobility without wealth. The world's roads were democratizing. Peugeot's Renaissance and the French philosophy of restraint. Among all European manufacturers, Peugeot stood out as a brand reborn by crisis. The company had endured turbulence in the 1970s, but emerged in the 1980s with a newfound sense of identity. Pragmatic, yet soulful. The success of the 205 gave Peugeot not only financial stability, but also creative momentum. It was the proof that French engineering could be as disciplined as German precision and as expressive as Italian design. The company began to build on that formula, crafting cars that balanced mechanical integrity with emotional resonance. Peugeot's engineers embraced a concept that would define their design language for years: motion within balance. Every decision, from chassis stiffness to engine placement, was measured against harmony. A Peugeot was not the loudest or the fastest, it was the most composed. This philosophy laid the groundwork for the next generation of Peugeot's compact lineage. As the decade moved toward its end, whispers began about a new model, smaller, sharper, and designed for a new era of urban life. That model would become the Peugeot 106. But before it arrived, the stage had to be set by cultural transformation. Cities, youth, and the rise of the urban compact. The late 1980s marked a new rhythm in the modern world. Urbanization accelerated. Technology became intimate. Personal computers entered homes, music became portable, and speed was redefined, not as physical velocity, but as adaptability. Young people of the era, especially in Europe, were growing up in tighter spaces, both physically and economically. They didn't want their parents' bulky sedans. They wanted cars that fit their lives. Nimble, affordable, stylish, and expressive. The compact hatchback became their badge of individuality. Automakers recognized this psychological shift. Cars were no longer just transport. They were statements of personality. Designers began to blend emotional appeal with mechanical logic. Colors brightened, interiors simplified, dashboards modernized. Even advertisements spoke to youth, not families. Live light, move smart. It's not the size that matters. It was no coincidence that during this time, cultural icons like the VW Golf GTI, Peugeot 205 GTI, Renault 5 Turbo, and Fiat Uno Turbo became symbols of rebellion and vitality. They embodied the new ideal, freedom through efficiency. The birth of the 106 era. As the 1980s turned to the 1990s, Peugeot faced a delicate challenge: how to follow the 205. a car that had defined a generation. The answer was not to make something bigger or flashier, but to make something purer. The Peugeot 106, launched in 1991, was conceived as the essence of modern compact design. It was small but never cramped, modest but never dull. Its lines were simple yet harmonious, a balance of proportion and purpose. The car felt alive, agile, and approachable, the perfect reflection of its time. Underneath, the 106 carried the distilled wisdom of 2 decades of adaptation. Lightweight materials, fuel-efficient engines, and refined aerodynamics made it both economical and enjoyable to drive. Peugeot's engineers understood that the future of cars lay not in excess, but in mastery of simplicity. The 106 was born into a Europe that had fully accepted the downsizing philosophy. It was not a reaction to crisis anymore. It was the natural expression of a matured industry. The car's success proved that small was no longer a defensive measure. It was a confident choice. A mirror of its time. The early 1990s were a peculiar intersection of optimism and realism. The Cold War had ended, economies were globalizing, and the information age was dawning. The Peugeot 106 fit perfectly into this landscape. Compact, efficient, and quietly confident. It was a car designed for a world where speed was measured in connection, not consumption. Commuters wanted reliability. Young professionals wanted mobility. Cities demanded efficiency. The 106 delivered all of it, with unpretentious grace. In many ways, the 106 was the final chapter in a 20-year evolution. A car that carried the DNA of every lesson learned since 1973. From the oil crisis to the age of environmental consciousness, it represented humanity's journey from indulgence to intelligence. The legacy of downsizing. By the time the 106 and its contemporaries filled the streets, the concept of downsizing was no longer a reaction. It was a design philosophy. The pursuit of efficiency had matured into a celebration of balance. Engineers spoke of weight distribution, drag coefficients, and power-to-efficiency ratios with the same reverence that earlier generations reserved for horsepower. The automobile had become self-aware. Not a symbol of dominance, but of adaptation. Every liter of fuel saved, every kilogram of weight reduced, was a victory of thought over impulse. This shift transcended the automobile itself. It reflected a deeper societal transformation, the idea that progress could be achieved not by consuming more, but by thinking better. The 106, like many of its peers, was proof that necessity could give birth to artistry. The road ahead, the world that had once been forced into efficiency by crisis, had now chosen it by conviction. The lessons of the 1970s had ripened into a global design ethic. When the Peugeot 106 rolled off assembly lines, it wasn't just another small car, it was the embodiment of 20 years of evolution, a compact monument to human resilience and creativity. The next decades would bring new challenges: emissions, urban congestion, and the digital revolution. But the philosophy born out of that first oil shock, the belief that restraint and intelligence are the true engines of progress, would endure. The age of shrinking steel had begun as a survival story. By the 1990s, it had become a symphony, a harmonious blend of design, technology, and humility. And somewhere on a narrow European street, a small Peugeot 106 hummed softly, carrying forward the legacy of an era that had learned to move the world with less. The early 1990s were a time of transformation, not just for cars, but for the world that drove them. The Cold War was over, Europe was reconnecting, and the first wave of globalization was beginning to define everyday life. The cities felt younger, faster, more compact. The Peugeot 106, the Renault Clio, the Fiat Punto, and the Volkswagen Polo didn't merely populate these streets, they shaped them. For a moment in history, the automobile and society moved in perfect harmony. Compact cars embodied the optimism of the time, efficient, democratic, and accessible. The world had learned how to move forward with less. The downsizing movement, born from the pain of crisis 2 decades earlier, had matured into a confident philosophy, a way of thinking that saw elegance in simplicity and pride in restraint. But even as the 1990s celebrated this new balance, the seeds of another transformation were already being planted. The 1990s, when small ruled the world. Throughout the 1990s, small cars reigned supreme in Europe and much of Asia. They were affordable, reliable, and surprisingly fun to drive. Manufacturers competed to make compact cars feel larger inside, smoother on the road, and safer for their occupants. The Peugeot 106, introduced in 1991, became a symbol of that perfection. It was light, elegant, and unpretentious, the kind of car that didn't shout for attention but earned admiration through experience. It coexisted beautifully with its sibling, the Citroën Saxo, and rivaled the Renault Clio and Fiat Punto. Together, they defined what small cars were supposed to be: agile, efficient, and effortlessly stylish. In Western Europe, cityscapes were changing. Streets grew busier, parking tighter, and urban living more expensive. Small cars became the logical and emotional choice. They were the cars of students, young couples, and professionals who valued freedom over status. Driving a compact car was not about compromise anymore. It was a declaration of independence. In Japan, the philosophy evolved even further. The K-car, an ultra-compact vehicle designed for narrow streets and limited parking, became a phenomenon. Cars like the Suzuki Wagon R, Daihatsu Move, and Honda Today showed how far efficiency could be pushed without losing personality. They became part of Japanese identity, symbols of urban grace and practicality. Meanwhile, in the United States, the story was more complicated. The lessons of the oil crisis had faded somewhat in the haze of economic recovery and cheap fuel. The 1990s American driver still preferred larger vehicles, sedans, trucks, and the emerging category of SUVs, but even there, a quiet shift was happening beneath the surface. Honda Civics and Toyota Corollas became fixtures on American roads, especially among younger generations who wanted reliability and thrift without losing modernity. For the first time, the small car wasn't a reaction to scarcity. It was a choice born of intelligence. The turn of the millennium, technology and temptation. By the late 1990s, technology was beginning to reshape the automobile. Electronic control units, better materials, and advanced manufacturing made cars safer and more capable than ever. Engineers could now build small cars that handled like much larger ones. But that same technology also brought temptation. The temptation to grow again. Customers began to expect more features: air conditioning, airbags, sound systems, power steering, electric windows, better insulation. These luxuries, once reserved for larger models, crept into smaller cars, and with them came extra weight. Manufacturers found themselves in a paradox. They had spent 2 decades learning how to make cars smaller and lighter, and now they were being asked to make them feel larger and more comfortable again. The 2000s arrived with a quiet contradiction. While efficiency remained a design goal, comfort began to reassert itself as a cultural value. People wanted both. And that desire would lead to one of the most dramatic shifts in automotive history. The rise of the SUV, a reversal of the compact ideal. Around the turn of the millennium, a new kind of vehicle began to dominate showrooms, the sport utility vehicle. What began as a niche category for off-road enthusiasts in the 1980s became a symbol of success and freedom in the 2000s. SUVs promised everything: space, safety, and status. They stood taller, felt more secure, and projected confidence. To many, they represented the comfort and stability that globalization and urban life seemed to be eroding. The car was growing again, both in size and symbolism. Ironically, the SUV craze began in the very markets that had once led the downsizing revolution. In Europe, models like the BMW X5, Volkswagen Touareg, and later the Nissan Qashqai redefined family transport. In America, the shift was even more dramatic. Ford Explorers, Chevrolet Tahoes, and Jeep Grand Cherokees filled suburban driveways. The age of shrinking steel appeared to be over. The roads were once again dominated by size. But beneath the surface, the lessons of downsizing had not been forgotten. Engineers continued to refine smaller engines, better aerodynamics, and lighter materials. The SUVs themselves began to adopt the logic of efficiency: turbocharged small displacement engines, hybrid systems, and modular platforms. The spirit of the 1970s oil crisis, do more with less, quietly lived on, even inside these larger bodies. The Green Awakening. As the first decade of the new millennium unfolded, a different kind of crisis began to emerge, not one of scarcity, but of sustainability. The words climate change and carbon footprint entered the global lexicon. Scientists warned of rising temperatures, melting ice caps, and the environmental cost of unchecked consumption. The automotive world once again found itself at a crossroads. Governments imposed stricter emission standards, and consumers became more conscious of their ecological impact. Suddenly, the virtues of the small car, efficiency, lightness, and restraint, gained moral weight. In 1997, Toyota had already introduced the Prius, the world's first mass-produced hybrid car. It was small, futuristic, and unapologetically efficient, a direct descendant, philosophically, of the oil crisis mentality. While it was initially seen as a curiosity, the Prius would become a global icon of environmental responsibility. Europe followed with its own innovations. Peugeot and Citroën experimented with diesel hybrid concepts. Volkswagen introduced small turbocharged petrol engines under the TSI banner. Fiat launched its clever twin-air two-cylinder engines. Downsizing returned, but this time it was not imposed by crisis. It was embraced as ethics. Engineers learned to extract 150 horsepower from 1.2 liters, and consumers began to appreciate efficiency not as sacrifice, but as sophistication. The 2010s, digital precision, and the new compact renaissance. By the 2010s, technology had transformed the automobile once again. Computers were now as central to driving as pistons and valves. Electronic stability systems, advanced navigation, and lightweight materials redefined performance. Downsizing evolved into a high science. Engines grew smaller, turbochargers became standard, and emissions dropped dramatically. The 1.0-liter, three-cylinder engine, once a symbol of poverty, was now capable of powering cars with grace and agility. But it wasn't just about engines anymore. The concept of small expanded to mean smart. Compact cars were now connected, customizable, and efficient in every sense of the word. In cities around the world, from Paris to Seoul to São Paulo, the compact car became the perfect urban companion once again. Peugeot's successors to the 106, the 107, 108, and later the 208 carried the lineage forward. Each iteration retained the essence of lightness and simplicity, even as technology layered new complexity beneath the surface. The philosophy of the 1970s had found its digital form: electric revolution, the return of the minimalist dream. The arrival of electric vehicles in the 2010s and 2020s marked the next great transformation, one that echoed the spirit of the original downsizing movement, but through entirely new means. Electric cars, with their silent efficiency and minimal mechanical parts, represented the ultimate distillation of the automotive ideal: maximum motion, minimum waste. Once again, efficiency was the goal, but now it was driven by electrons, not gasoline. The small electric car became the new frontier. Models like the Renault Zoe, BMW i3, and Peugeot E208 embodied a new kind of progress. They were clean, compact, and perfectly suited to the rhythms of modern cities. The very qualities that had defined the downsizing revolution, agility, intelligence, restraint, returned, now powered by renewable ambition. The irony was poetic. 50 years after the 1973 oil crisis, the automotive world had circled back to the same principle. Less is more. The cultural afterlife of the compact car. Yet even beyond technology, the cultural legacy of the compact car endures. The idea that smaller can be better has seeped into how people think about everything, from homes to devices to lifestyles. Minimalism, sustainability, and the conscious consumption are the modern echoes of that first oil crisis. The Peugeot 106, the Fiat Panda, the Honda Civic, all were precursors to a world that values thoughtfulness over extravagance. Classic car enthusiasts today speak of these small 1980s and 1990s compacts with reverence. They represent a purer time, when engineering ingenuity mattered more than marketing budgets. Their lightness gives them a character that modern cars, burdened with technology, sometimes lack. To drive a 106 today is to feel history beneath your fingertips. The history of an idea that began with a crisis and evolved into a creed. The eternal lesson of downsizing. The age of shrinking steel was never just about smaller cars. It was about humility. It taught an industry and a civilization that progress cannot be measured by size or power alone. It must be measured by wisdom. Every era has its own kind of crisis. The oil embargo of 1973 was only the first reminder that resources are finite. Today, climate change, urban congestion, and digital overload challenge us in new ways. But the solution remains rooted in the same philosophy: smarter, lighter, leaner. The future may belong to electric cars, autonomous systems, and digital ecosystems, but their success will still depend on the same principle that saved the automobile half a century ago: efficiency with grace. Epilogue. The circle completed. The story that began with the roaring engines of the 1960s and the despair of the 1970s has come full circle. Humanity learned that motion is not about dominance over nature, but harmony within it. The Peugeot 106, and every small car before and after it, stands as a quiet monument to that realization. It reminds us that greatness often wears a modest face, a small hatchback, humming through city streets, consuming little, offering much. Perhaps that is why, even in an age of electric hypercars and self-driving machines, the sight of a compact, well-designed car still stirs something deeply human. It represents the essence of what the automobile was always meant to be: freedom, responsibility, and beauty in balance. the age of shrinking steel never truly ended. It simply evolved into an age of intelligent motion. And as the world drives toward an uncertain future, one truth endures. The smallest machines often carry the largest ideas,